In 20 years, 1 million people will be living on Mars. That is, at least according to Elon Musk. But also, like, here's the thing, whether that's a pipe dream or a possible reality, that may not matter, because the consequences could very well be the same. And that's because launching rockets at anything like the scale that would be required to fulfill Musk's vision, or even just attempt it, that could mean altering our atmosphere and affecting our planet in ways that we still don't fully understand. And so ultimately, the effort to make sure humans have a new place to live in case something happens to Earth, it could actually be the thing that makes the Earth a worse place to live in. Some saying that means that Musk's mission to Mars, it may just be bringing us closer to the future that it claims to be protecting us from. But with all that, right, the first thing that you should know is that while Musk is in the headlines for a lot of reasons, the thing that seems to drive him more than anything is making humanity a multi-planetary species. In fact, he's actually publicly claimed that he only accumulates assets, including a controversial $47 billion Tesla pay package this year to fund his plans for Mars. In fact, he has straight up testified to that in court. And you know, this whole idea, it goes back to when he was 10 years old and he read Isaac Asimov's 1951 science fiction novel, Foundation. Right, that's a book about a man who travels to a faraway planet to try and preserve human knowledge and civilization from the fall of an interstellar empire. And it's also a book that Musk talks about all the time. With him telling Rolling Stone in 2017, the lesson I drew from that is you should try to take the set of actions that are likely to prolong civilization, minimize the probability of a dark age, and reduce the length of a dark age if there is one. With him then going on to say things like, there's high urgency to making life multi-planetary. We've got to do it while civilization is so strong. And whatever your feelings about him, and I have some, he has seemingly pursued this goal with remarkable consistency. In fact, that mission has actually driven nearly every business venture he's undertaken on Earth. And I'm not just talking about SpaceX. I mean, take Twitter, for example. Musk reportedly told people that he bought the platform to help test how a citizen-led government that rules by consensus might work on Mars. And then there's the Boring Company. Right? That's a Musk company that provides tunnel construction services here on Earth. But apparently, it was really started, at least in part, to develop equipment to drill under Mars's surface. In fact, they even sell Tunnel Mars t-shirts online. And Tesla? Musk has said that he envisions people on the planet will drive a version of the company's steel-paneled Cybertrucks. And there's also the possibility that Tesla-built solar panels are what Musk intends to use to heat homes and create energy on Mars, at least according to people familiar with his plans. And then also, going back to SpaceX, it's not just the rockets. The company has reportedly partnered with a plant-based alternative meat company not only to provide food in its cafeterias, but also to test the products as a possible protein source for Mars. But of course, also, yes, the rockets are the big thing. And with that, SpaceX's Starship, right, the spacecraft meant to ferry astronauts to the moon and Mars, it recently survived a re-entry into Earth's atmosphere for the first time. And all of this as Musk has significantly moved up his timeline for settling Mars, with it being just this year that he started making that claim about 1 million people living on Mars in 20 years. Whereas, in the past, he said it would take 40 to 100 years to have a self-sustaining civilization on the planet. And notably there, that 20-year target, it's roughly the same timeline NASA has set for what it's called the audacious goal of just getting anyone there at all. So with all that, of course, there are massive questions about whether or not Musk is just full of shit, or with even his own employees expressing their doubts about his timeline, with some even suggesting that it was about competing with fellow space-savvy billionaire Jeff Bezos. But either way, there is a reason to believe that he is serious, right? Because this year he has reportedly started asking SpaceX employees to start thinking more concretely about the specific details of a future Martian city. He has one team coming up with plans for small dome habitats, including the materials that could be used to build them. Then another is working on spacesuits to deal with Mars's unforgiving environment. There's a medical team researching whether humans can have children there. And Musk himself has even allegedly volunteered his sperm to help seed a colony. Which, yes, it does sound like the most Elon Musk thing, but also I should say that Musk has denied that. But in any case, right, the point of all that is to say that Musk's mind seems to be made up, with him having decided he is willing to do whatever it's gonna take. While he believes that it will benefit the human race, it's also all of humanity that may have to bear the cost of his decision if he's wrong. Because on the surface, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from spaceflight, it's pretty negligible. The percentage of fossil fuels burned by the space industry, it's only about 1% of that burned by conventional aviation. And then even there, aviation only makes up around 2% of overall global emissions. But notably, the deeper truth is more complicated. And that's because emissions from spaceflight are in some ways more harmful than an equivalent amount of emission from some other sector. And with that, scientists are especially worried about soot released from rockets collecting in the lower layer of the middle atmosphere, or the layer called the stratosphere. Notably, it's home to the ozone layer, or the thing shielding us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, and it is extremely sensitive. I mean, if you're old enough, you might even remember being told that you are destroying the ozone layer by using hairspray.
Look at the size of that aerosol abomination. I've got to stop it before it depletes the ozone layer and everyone gets a nasty sunburn.
Which, by the way, it did not just magically change. Thankfully, there was this little treaty called the Montreal Protocol that successfully set limits on chemicals known to harm the ozone layer, or like those that used to be found in hairspray that aren't there anymore. With all of that being a fantastic example of the world coming together to deal with an atmospheric emergency. But in any case, right, the Montreal Protocol unfortunately did not address rocket emissions or satellites. And the impacts from the soot that I mentioned, it's potentially massive. In fact, in a paper published in 2022, soot from rockets was shown to be nearly 500 times as efficient at heating the atmosphere as soot released from sources like airplanes closer to the surface. So with that, we have Eloise Moraes, one of the authors of the paper, telling the New York Times, that means that as we start to grow the space space industry and launch more rockets, we are going to start seeing that effect magnify very quickly. And actually, to that point, another study published in 2022 found that if the rate of rocket launches increased by just a factor of 10, their emissions could cause temperatures in parts of the stratosphere to rise as much as 2 degrees Celsius. And that is a level of warming that could begin to degrade the ozone over most of North America, all of Europe, and a big chunk of Asia. And to be clear with that, the idea that the rate of rocket launches could increase by a factor of 10, it's not all that far-fetched. If anything, it could actually be a conservative prediction. I mean, in just the past few years, for example, the number of rocket launches has spiked as commercial companies and government agencies have launched thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit. And notably there, SpaceX is leading the way, with the company in 2023 launching nearly 100 rockets on its own, and in 2024, it's reportedly aiming to launch nearly 150. And with that, right now, those launches are mostly to build the company's Starlink satellite constellation, which is basically supposed to provide high-speed internet to the entire world. But of course, notably, like most things SpaceX does, it's also about getting ready for life on Mars, with Musk actually saying that the key to funding his Mars vision being the Starlink satellite project. And then beyond that, SpaceX has won funding from NASA to look into adapting its Starlink satellites for use in a Martian communication network. And a big key thing with that is that many satellites have a lifetime of 5 to 15 years. So with that, you'll have to replace these satellites, meaning more rockets, more emissions, more soot in the atmosphere. And then also with that, the satellites themselves are also a potential source of ozone depleting pollution, with a study last year saying the metal from defunct satellites re-entering the atmosphere could, quote, induce changes in the stratospheric aerosol layer. But with that, specifically, I should also say the ultimate effects of those metals, it's still not known. And either way, but especially in the case of SpaceX, sending satellites into orbit is just one of the reasons that the number of rocket launches is expected to keep going up. Because you have SpaceX developing Starship, which is a nearly 400-foot reusable rocket for the NASA moon mission. But importantly, it also might be the model of rocket to eventually send residents to Mars, with people familiar with the plan saying future versions of the rocket could have a living space in its nose, several floors of living quarters, and even amenities like a running track and a movie theater. And there, Starship may carry 100 passengers at a time to Mars, and that journey would happen about every 2 years. With Musk also reportedly telling SpaceX employees that he'd use Starship as a sort of Noah's Ark, carrying plants and animals on the initial voyage. And then, of course, the way we started this whole thing is with the fact that Musk apparently plans to put 1 million people on Mars by the middle of the 20th century. Right? And even if that is, yes, a long shot, if you got even a fraction of that many people into space, it would mean a massive increase in the number of launches, especially if you then factor in all the test runs that need to happen as well. And in fact, just in July, SpaceX started pushing to sharply increase Starship launches in the coming years. And specifically there, it proposed to launch up to 25 times annually from its complex in Texas. So under a plan approved by the government in 2022, it only has permission to conduct up to 5 orbital flights there every year. And then also, notably, apart from enabling humankind to colonize Mars and possibly as another way of funding this mission, SpaceX has also proposed Starship as a way of intercontinental travel that could shorten the duration of the longest journeys on Earth to less than half an hour. And so with that, you have Andrew Wilson, an assistant professor in environmental management at a university in Scotland, telling Space.com, the amount of pollution that would cause in comparison to aircraft is orders of magnitude of a difference. And also saying there, we are in a climate crisis. We already saw warming that is close to the targets of the Paris Agreement. And here we go, creating a massive launcher, which is going to just add more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Though also, hitting on that point, I should also mention there have been efforts on SpaceX's part to reduce the emissions from these launches. Right, most rockets use kerosene fuel, but notably, SpaceX's Starship uses a mix of liquid methane and liquid oxygen propellants. And one day, it could even be powered by liquid hydrogen. But still there, at the end of the day, we are a long way from having totally green space travel, right? And methane is a greenhouse gas up to 90 times more potent in trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And then even if they were propelled by liquid hydrogen, that would produce water vapor, and that's a greenhouse gas too. And ultimately, any hydrocarbon fuel produces some amount of soot, with one scientist telling the Times, there is no such thing as a totally neutral propellant. They all have different impacts. And then also, of course, with that, a full understanding of the environmental impact would have to account for the greenhouse gases generated by the manufacturing of Starship vehicles. But that's also an even tougher number to pin down. Although something else to consider are the local impacts of SpaceX launches. Like in June, for example, a Starship blastoff burned 7.5 million pounds of fuel and sent chunks of metal and insulation flying to one side of a state park and also igniting a small fire. And in fact, SpaceX operations have reportedly caused fires, leaks, explosions, or other problems at this facility in Texas at least 19 times since 2019. With the company also allegedly conducting tests without the proper permits and going ahead with launches despite being told not to do so by the FAA and otherwise violating agreements with local authorities. But with all that said, I gotta pass a question off to you. What are your thoughts with all this? And if possible, try to give me your opinion without thinking about Musk's politics or your feelings outside of this situation.